World Regions Geography 110, United States and Canada, Part 8, Demography and Urbanization. In the United States, whites make up 3/4 of the total population, and minorities have a higher fertility rate, which means that minority women typically have more children than non-minorities, than white females, which means that population is growing. Hispanics are the largest minority. What you see here in these three demographic projections, well, this is not a projection. This is the way the population was. In other words, what percent are minorities in these given regions? Highest minority population concentration was New Mexico, and then you have a number of states where you have high minority populations. Interesting, Illinois there because of Chicago, high minority population. But you see, by 2040, that will dramatically change, with minority populations, even in these intermountain states, projected to make up 1/4 of the population. On all of the border states, primarily due to Latino populations, you'll see much larger, more than 50%, and by 2060, dominated across the country, where the majority of people, these states are not highly populated. So probably in this time frame or this time frame, the country will be predominantly minorities. Now, it does not mean Latino. It could be Asians. And so you'll see these immigrant populations in the U.S. Now, Canada has a different situation. You have a lot of British and French descendants. You have immigrant populations. Parts of Canada have some large populations from Caribbean regions, particularly like that area around Montreal. And then you have British Columbia, which has a high population of Asian immigrants. But the rest of Canada, very much smaller populations of immigrants. A lot less impact, even though it's got a smaller population. Immigration in the United States, this first wave of immigration was the 1820s to 1870s, largely Irish and German, partly the way the British treated the Irish, and the Irish potato famine caused a lot of the Irish migration. German migration was just lack of economic opportunity, and so you had Germans, particularly skilled Germans, whereas the Irish tended to be unskilled. Moving to the U.S., immigrating to the U.S., very large change. A lot of the Civil War troops, as soon as they came off the boat, were given their citizenship and signed up at the same time for the Union military and shipped off to war. Second wave is that 1870 to early 1900s. That was your Eastern and Southern European, in other words, your Italians, your Greeks, Armenians, Jews from Eastern Europe, Russians, Poles, Slavs, people from the Balkans. That's that second wave. And the third wave is 1970. And that third wave is largely because of the change in immigration laws in 1965, where we completely revamped immigration to allow, up until then, Europeans, particularly Northern Europeans, were prioritized. And after that point, they started to allow Asians and Latinos in, and that's that third wave, largely Latino, Asian, either Chinese, Indian populations, Middle Eastern populations that were not allowed in previously. Canada, on the other hand, largely French settlers initially, English that were royalists, that were pro-Britain during the Revolutionary War, left and went north into Canada after the war. They were relocated to Canada. So that's the Canadian population. It's been fairly resistant to immigrants until relatively recent. In the U.S. right now, you have a lot of political talk about immigrants and resistance to immigrants and resentment of immigrants. A lot of it has to do with power shifts, economic confrontation. You do see some hate crimes. I don't think that's anything new. It's sad to say, but I don't think it is. But I think it does go to how we see ourselves as a people, and I think it's something that we need to think about is, how do we see ourselves as a people? Are we a country of immigrants? Do we see ourselves as an immigrant nation? And how does this change in how we see immigrants change who we are as a people? It's a little food for thought. You can see pre-1970, 78% of the people that immigrated to the U.S. came from Europe, pre-1970. Since 1970, and since, 56%, 57% have come from Asia. Something to think about. Demography and urbanization, continued urbanization and industrialization. A lot of times when we look at American history, we think of villages, small villages like you see in the movies, Western, natives following the herds. But there was a lot of urbanization in native cultures prior to Europeans arriving. The Algonquins, the Iroquois up in the New York State, that region, urbanized cities. Certainly Mexico, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas were highly urbanized. So urbanization was not something that was brought by the Europeans. It was already here. Maybe we just don't recognize it. European settlements began as commercial centers, often simply a port or a place to protect an export locale. There's lots of areas where we were exporting material to Europe from, and they built cities to protect those export communities. What you see is the development first in the northeast part of the U.S., where there was a lot of hills, a lot of running streams, where they used water power for manufacturing. You began manufacturing. Was that industrialization that made the U.S., the colonies, the North American colonies, the British, one of the wealthiest places in the world as far as colonial territories. People had a higher standard of living in the 13 colonies than actually people did in England at the time. Now, the wealthy in England lived pretty nice, but the common people in England didn't have as good a diet. They didn't eat as much protein. They didn't have as much food. They didn't have as much income. Americans were traders, and we were shipping In the South, they were making a lot of money off commodities, indigo, tobacco, and cotton. And in the North, they were shipping fish and lumber and trading with different regions. And it was that conflict with the British over that kind of led to the American Revolution. The British trying to tax it and wanting to control it, and people resented it. So you have this creation of urban areas by the pull of manufacturing, first in the Northeast, and then you had that going on in the Mid-Atlantic states and in the Great Lakes region. And then you had, subsequent to World War II, after World War II, you became this big suburbanization movement. People getting out of the cities, people moving to the suburbs. The social structure in the communities, in cities, began to collapse. The inner city, poor people came there. Jobs fled with the suburbanization. Retailing fled. Cities like Turlock and Modesto used to have vibrant downtowns. Now, not so much. You have shopping centers in the suburbs where people shop and live, and now you're beginning to see a movement back to city cores, and I think it may change the way we see cities, and part of that is due because of transportation and cost of fossil fuels. Future geographies, U.S. dominance. The U.S. will probably still dominate the global economy through this century. You do have a challenge from China. There is a lot of talk about China's basic structure and whether it will survive the bubble that's about ready to burst there in real estate that will make the 2008 recession in the U.S. look like chump change. I think you'll see a collapse of China. China is trying to shift to a consumer economy from an export economy. I think that's a problem for them. Security and terrorism and the war with ISIS, it's ongoing. I don't think it's going to end soon. We're gonna have to develop new strategies for dealing with this type of non-land-based, non-state-based enemy, and new ways of fighting it. I think that's being developed right now. And environmental change. There's significant effects, but localized variation. So there's a lot of potential negative things happening with global warming, and there's also some costs that are things that are being done to change that and change how we deal with our environment in a more friendly way. And that's the end of that chapter.